Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay. That's Robert Frost's Nothing Gold Can Stay. Welcome to Stories in Colour, a podcast from the National Gallery in London, uncovering the mysteries of colour in culture, art and history. Do make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any episodes. And this is the final episode in our miniseries telling the story of a rare, sparkling and glistening colour. It's been called the tears of the gods, the sweat of the sun, a universal language and a barbaric relic, and it's had a profound impact on the history of art. The colour and material we're talking about is, of course, gold. I'm Beks Leary from the digital department here at the gallery, and to help us look at this subject in a contemporary light today, I'm joined by Caroline Miller and Priyesh Mistry. Caroline is the courses and events programmer here at the gallery. She develops online and in-person courses that expand access and engagement for the National Gallery's audiences, both nationally and internationally. Building on her interdisciplinary background in art history, archaeology, fine art and neuroscience, much of her research and work explores material history, artistic studio practices and the concept of artist as a collector. Priyesh is Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Projects here at the gallery, where he works towards an ambitious programme to integrate contemporary art within the context of the museum and its historic collections. Priyesh is a member of the Faculty of Fine Arts at the British School at Rome, sits on the Fourth Plinth Commissioning Group, led by the Mayor of London's office, and is a trustee of Studio Voltaire. He is also on the 2025 jury for the Turner Prize. Big welcome both of you to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. Caroline, Priyesh.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's great for you guys to be here. And we will have a little look back now, just at what we've already covered in the first two episodes in our story of gold, just to give us some context. So we've looked at how this very unbothered and precious metal doesn't react to anything at all, and how humanity has prized it from ancient times. It's inspired myths, greed and devotion. And we've looked at how artists have used and depicted gold in the Western European artistic tradition, with a transition between gold as a material towards gold as a colour captured in paint. And today we're answering a question that actually came in from our YouTube channel. So thank you to you who asked this, from a subscriber who wanted to know some stories about gold's usage by modern artists. So we are diving into modern and contemporary art to see what gold has meant and has been used to mean over the last 100 years or so. And we'll be looking at it in a kind of few different themes. So how gold has been used by artists in a spiritual or symbolic or ritualistic sense, how it's been used as a material in a kind of historical sense, and then also how it's been used in a very consumeristic or capitalistic way, or to question those ideas. So we're going to get stuck in with our first artist to look at, who's Joseph Beuys. So who's this artist and how was he using or looking at gold and ritual?
Thanks, Beks. Well, it's really interesting thinking back about artists that have employed gold in various ways over the past century. And Joseph Beuys is one of those artists that you have to talk about when you're thinking about gold, particularly because of the way that he took so many different materials, often very everyday materials, and imbued them with power and a kind of symbolism that harked back to either ancient cultures or previous cultures in some way. So Joseph Beuys, he's a German artist. He is really fundamental to the way that we think about conceptual art in the 20th century. He reflected lots of concepts within his work around humanism and sociology. He was a sculptor, a teacher, a political activist. He was really pioneering in the field of environmentalism and also self-styled himself as a shaman. So he was really, took on all of these guises to really think about many of the themes that we're considering today in the 21st century. He was doing during that post-war moment in the 50s, right up to the 80s, before he passed away. He was a member of Dadaist movement, Fluxus, and really was influential in developing this idea of performance art. And I guess this is kind of one of the this leads us on to actually one of his most iconic performances, which involved gold, which was a performance called How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair. And it was first performed in 1965, but it's a performance where he occupied a gallery space, a gallery where he was showing his own drawings, his own works on the walls. But at the opening, he refused to let anybody in and instead enacted this performance work where he'd was sitting initially on a chair, cradling a dead hare, and had his head covered in honey and gold. And throughout the kind of period of this performance, he would sort of talk inaudibly to the hare, as if explaining art, the art that was on the walls, to this inanimate creature.
This is quite the picture, isn't it, of the kind of really sticky, gooey honey on his head and presumably quite thin gold leaf that was stuck all over him, and he's having this conversation. Why gold? Why gold in this context?
Well, the hare, first of all, is an animal that was associated with a lot of symbolic meanings in Greek mythology. And I think on top of that, gold is, you've talked about in the first episode of this podcast, it really ties into the mythic, the historical, and it's a big thing in German history as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. But gold is also symbolic for the power of the sun, wisdom, and purity. And honey also is actually a Germanic symbol for rebirth. And so I think the combination of those two is quite powerful and puts this work into a different history or trajectory by using these really mythological, ritualistic materials.
Yeah.
And how their symbolism impacts that.
And we should say it was a real dead hare as well,
Yes.
which many might find quite shocking.
Yeah. I mean, the images are still really shocking of this moment.
Yeah.
So, of course, there's much performance, the performances come and go. And they only exist now, particularly those early performances that were being very radical in the sort of 50s and the 60s. They only exist really in photographs. And when you see these photographs that are now in museum collections all around the world, it's all in black and white photography. The images are still very wistful because you know that the animal that he's cradling isn't alive anymore. You see the kind of shimmer of gold that encases his head. It's quite extraordinary as an image. And it really does, it harks back to all of those kind of references that Caroline was talking about just now, that, you have, the idea of the kind of spiritual references in that material. But also he was really interested in it as a material that comes from the earth. Mm-hmm. So this ties in so much to this idea of being in Germany after the end of the war, where this idea of mysticism and creating mythology around how we relate to the earth and how we relate to each other was really frowned upon and kind of ridden out of society. So in a sense, he was such an interesting artist in terms of trying to grapple with that question of how do we create art after the war? How do we consider and reconcile society in some way? How do we think about the world around us at this kind of quite pivotal moment where suddenly, your culture has been sort of eradicated in so many different ways? And so he was using, all of these materials from the earth, and gold was very particular for that because it had so many of these qualities. And it was a material that he sort of used in different ways across his work. But this one seems very powerful because it's so, I think to many of us thinking about Beuys's work, it seems very esoteric. It's very difficult to kind of penetrate because he's often using materials that don't seem as if they have much relevance, or we can't really read into the symbolism of them. So it was... But there's something really interesting about the quality of gold that allows you in.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's interesting, too, that he started the performance for multiple hours by himself before he let the public in, too. So it's, he's creating almost a ritualistic moment with himself before the public even gets to see it. And I wonder if that ties into his background in being a shaman or, but creating that sort of ritualistic environment before even the public is allowed into the space to experience it with him is quite powerful.
Amazing.
It was totally part of that idea of him self-mythologizing himself, you know, so creating a sort of aura around him as being this kind of shaman. In this kind of performative way, but yes, really asking that question of how do we, you know, understand, relate to the world around us in this kind of interesting moment, which is something that I think other German artists have done.
So we can look at another German artist now, Anselm Kiefer, who's born in 1945, working in Germany and also working in that kind of post-war period as a response to the war and to the German psyche at the time. Many of you will know the artist, but introduce us to him for those who might not have heard of him.
Yes, so Kiefer was actually a student of Joseph Beuys as well, which is quite interesting, and that's also part of where his love of mythology was built. It was part of his training with Beuys. But Kiefer, for those of you who don't know him, really is a prolific German artist known for his large scale and sort of intensely layered work, both materially and mythologically, historically, who is really grappling with cycles of history, a lot related to the German history, but he's also weaving ancient mythologies, contemporary moments, more modern and contemporary artists as well. We know he references Van Gogh often as well, but his works are massive in scale, both literally and sort of symbolically. And you've just been researching him for this. The layers that you go through in each painting is just extraordinary.
Yeah. Even like physical layers, right?
Yes,
so you
very much so.
You see the scale of the works on the wall, but also like almost they have their own depth, don't they? Because of all the materials he's building.
Yes, they're really monumental. And he works across a lot of different materials. Gold is one of them, but he's also works a lot with lead and parts of the earth, a lot of dirt, you know, straw. Again, I think I wonder if this is in reference to Beuys, but he also talks a lot about alchemy. And I think this is something that's really interesting as we're talking about modern artists and artists in general. Artists are makers of, you know, they take these common materials, transform them in a way to make a larger impact. But Kiefer says that alchemy is not to make gold. The real alchemist is not interested in material things, but in transubstantiation and transforming the spirit. It's a spiritual thing more than a material thing. An alchemist puts the phenomena of the world in another context. And that's really what he's doing with his work.
Yeah, just to explain alchemy, for those who don't know, it's kind of like early chemistry, I guess. So trying to work out how they can make things out of other things without the kind of chemical understanding that we have today. And one of those things, obviously, that everyone kind of was the holy grail that you wanted to create was gold. And lead was one of those metals that early alchemists thought you might be able to make into gold.
So it's really interesting that Kiefer uses both of these materials in his work. We know he was also interested in the alchemist Robert Fludd, who was a 16th and early 17th century famous alchemist. But if you look at his work specifically, one series that we could look at is his series Mein Rhine, which are these extraordinary panels that are engaging with the Rhine River, which Kiefer grew up on. The Rhineland itself is a really complicated historical place of geography. Wars have been fought for centuries in that space. And so Kiefer is grappling with the history of that, as well as a mythological history that's quite deep and related to Germanic mythologies and histories. So these works are these incredibly large panels, often, I mean, he does some with forests, and it's all mixed media, but it's where he actually has gold ground, compared to a lot of times his gold leaf is sort of mixed in with a lot of other materials, but you actually get these gold skies where the turquoise waters of the Rhine meet the gold, and it's almost as when the light hits it, it creates a sort of heavenly
and this reminds us of, back into old pieces in the early medieval collection here at the gallery, where you have these gold ground backgrounds where the real gold leaf has been laid down almost abstractly behind the figures in the paintings. And that's cool that we've got this kind of reference back here.
And the series calls back to the National Gallery in even more ways too. He's actually inscribed in Latin Anselm fut hic, which means Anselm was here, in reference to our Van Eyck, Johannes de Eyck fut hic. So Johannes Van Eyck was here. But it's this artist being witness to history and reinterpreting it that I think is really powerful in this.
It's interesting thinking about Kiefer's relationship to alchemy, and the idea of transformation of these kind of earthly materials. That's something that he definitely would have got from his sort of his teachings from Beuys, and being able to transform these materials, transform these ideas of a material into something much bigger. And I think that's also something really interesting about the use of gold in the way that both Beuys and Kiefer do, to think about the potential, or the way that actually this kind of very earthly metal can be transformative in so many ways. I mean, this is exactly why artists were using it across millennia, really.
Absolutely. And I guess another historical moment that has this kind of symbolic value in our consciousness, especially here, was the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the historic peace summit between King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France that took place 500 years ago. And Kiefer's made work in reference to this as well, hasn't he?
Yes, he was part of a more recent exhibition, and it was actually named the Field of the Cloth of Gold after he made the works. So it was, it's also this sort of history imposing itself after the works are made, and how it's, can be in dialogue without intention necessarily to begin with. But Kiefer's such a great student of history, of poetry, of mythology, that once he completed the series, he named the series after this moment, because there was so much gold.
And the cloth of gold being, I guess, just to go back to the history there, the fact that they would have woven real gold into the fabrics of their clothing. And then I think Henry's whole marquee was made with gold cloth. And so this whole peace summit was very elaborately gold.
He even had 2 royal monkeys covered in gold leaf that had been gifts of the Ottoman Sultan at the time. So, and they were meant to sort of entertain the guests too. So it was that the summit was named after the just lavish displays of wealth and power that England and France were putting on for each other, trying to outdo one another. Which is quite interesting. And a lot, and this is the Tudor period, we have a lot of Tudor art, but so much of Tudor art doesn't exist anymore because it was part of this pageantry. So, so having this in the title, again, Kiefer's continuously weaving in all these layers of art history, mythology, even those that aren't necessarily present physically now to us.
Totally. And this is a good point for us to take a break, and we're going to move more into looking at gold again as a kind of historical technique and how more modern artists have referenced back to that. So we're going to be going to Gustav Klimt, who very famously has used a lot of gold in his work, after the break. So we'll see you very soon. Welcome back from the break. So we're going to be looking now at some artists who have been very interested in the materiality of gold. And we're going to start with Gustav Klimt, very famous for his golden phase. Caroline, tell us all about Klimt.
Well, there's lots to tell about Gustav Klimt, but we'll try to keep it to gold for now. But Klimt was the leading Viennese painter of the 20th century and was a leading member of the symbolist movement. But he actually comes from a family of goldsmiths and engravers. So he's quite an interesting artist because the technical understanding of gold was such an important part of his practice and his golden period that lasted from about 1898 to 1908. So we have about a decade where he's really working extensively in gold and transforming it for modern painting. So his dad was a gold engraver, and his youngest brother, George, was also an engraver and metalworker. And he actually worked with George on some of his frames, including the Palace Athena, which has some gold work in it. His brother helped make the frame for it. But
cool.
I think, you've probably covered this in the earlier podcast, but thinking about all the different ways gold is used, and Klimt was famous for employing all these different techniques, from gilding to using shell gold, which is basically the dust or leftover gold leaf from different projects, then gets made into a paint. But if you look at his works, especially one of his most famous works, The Kiss, otherwise known as The Lovers, that's now in the Belvedere collection in Vienna, he's employing so many different types of gold, and his works become almost like sculpture because of the way that he builds up the gold in different ways. The Kiss, for those who don't know the work, it's this couple in a passionate embrace. There's lots of different theories about who this couple might be, but looking at the gold work in it, they're both gilded in these different golden robes with different textures. He's almost creating textile, which was very much of that era, the Art Nouveau, that was looking also at different eras of art history. If you look at the woman's cloak, you have these sort of three-dimensional circles that are gilded on that may have been inspired by different sort of microbiology at the time that Klimt was really interested in. But it also could have been looking at Bronze Age era cultures and the association with circles and the female form in the womb. But there's a three-dimensional quality to it. So there's this objecthood that ties into the decorative fine arts as well as the fashion of that era. And we know that Klimt was really moved by a trip that he did to Venice and to Ravenna twice. I know on the last podcast you were talking about the mosaics at both places.
So the 6th century church of San Vitale in Ravenna, also in Italy, for those who hadn't had the pleasure. The amazing Byzantine mosaics there.
Of Justinian and Theodora.
Yes.
And there's a lot of similarities in another work called Woman in Gold. But we know that he's interested in those tesserae, the way that mosaics build up.
So the tesserae are the glass little squares that get backed
gilded
with gold.
Yeah. They get gilded, and the way that they reflect light is so different than if you're just gilding a clean gold ground. You're getting the three-dimensionality of them creates such a different glow, and as you move around a painting or move around a mosaic, you have a different experience. The gold feels alive, and you're seeing that in how he's constructing this image. And you have these more masculine rectangles that go up the male form. But what's really extraordinary is this ground that he creates that's a mixture of gold leaf, silver leaf, and platinum. And he layers it in different ways so it just reflects the light. It feels like you're in a golden cosmos.
It's almost starry, isn't
yes.
it?
Yeah.
Really
So
beautiful. And we should say as well, just to describe the painting a little more, there's kind of like a flower meadow almost that they're kneeling on. So the man kneels on the left and his hands are caressing the face of the woman on the right. And he leans down to kiss her on the cheek so that we only just see the side of his face. And the woman has both of her eyes closed and her cheeks are very flushed and her expression is very tender. And their gold robes are covered in, these decorative patterns that you've begun telling us about. And they do seem to be almost floating, don't they, in this kind of
cosmic
sea
space
of goldenness.
almost as if their love is enveloping them in this golden light, this golden warmth.
This is an amazing painting. When you see it in real life, it really, it draws you in. It's very captivating as a painting, but also it's such a great way of trying to describe this incredible emotion of love, of the kiss, of that adoration that you have for a partner. So suddenly taking this material, which is often used for very religious, spiritual subjects, to something that's very secular, part of our lives, all our lives in a way. And I guess that's kind of why this painting is so popular today. It's often, I see reproductions of it on people's fridges and
magnets and postcards.
Magnets and postcards. And when you go to see the work, it's flocked with visitors wanting to see it. And I think it's part of that visual appeal of gold, but done in a way where he's incredibly dexterous in the way that he's been able to use gold in so many different methods. And that definitely comes from his background.
And it's, from his family background and his proximity to it. That's also, there's lots of artists. Botticelli also started out as a goldsmith before he really turned to painting, and his use of gold in his paintings was
And you can listen, a bit more about Botticelli in one of the previous episodes.
So, but Klimt's technical understanding, I think, allows him to elevate, as you were saying, Priyesh, this very human moment to a mythical, cosmic level.
And you mentioned that we don't 100% know who the people are in the painting, but we think that it's probably a self-portrait of the artist with his lifelong partner and dress designer, Emily Flöger. And we should mention her because she does have this really profound impact, as a designer and artist herself on Klimt's work, and, designed dresses that were then depicted in Klimt's paintings.
And she's who he writes to when he talks about how incredibly stunning the mosaics in Ravenna were. So she was certainly on his mind as he was experimenting with gold.
And I guess, I think most people take this as romantic love, but again, we're not 100% sure whether this is purely romantic or is it platonic, or I kind of love that there's a question around that.
Whether it's a mythical story as well.
Yeah.
But it's a theme that's so universal.
Yes.
Totally.
Like gold across different cultures.
So we will skip forward now to another artist who has looked back into the Western tradition of painting and the use of gold in it, which is Barkley Hendricks, who was born in 1945, died in 2017, and was the first African-American painter to look back at icon paintings. So Priyesh, tell us about this artist.
Well, I think Barkley Hendricks is really picking up the mantle of Klimt in the way that he's using gold to reference so much around the sort of everyday life or people, everyday people. And, in a way that Klimt is transforming his figures into something that's much more ethereal, to spaces, to allow these figures to be swept up in an emotion and be able to share that with an audience. Barkley Hendricks is doing something so radical with the way that he's employing gold and metal leaf in his works. So as you said, he has this great interest in Byzantine and medieval religious icons, Greek and Roman culture, and looking back at the way that gold leaf was used in many of these artifacts and artworks from those eras. Barkley Hendricks became really well known for doing these almost kind of grand manner portraits of Black people. Grand manner is a sort of full-length portrait. So within a sort of European tradition, often you'd have the aristocratics and the royal families of the day requesting these full-length portraits by the most celebrated artists of that period. So if you come to the National Gallery in Central Hall, you'll find a kind of cross-history sweep of grand manner portraits. And it's interesting because, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, before these, the world wars, there's a moment where grand manner portraits become sort of out of fashion. Suddenly artists weren't thinking about portraiture in that way anymore, thinking about representing people in different ways. And so when you have someone like Barkley Hendricks, working during the civil rights era in America, employing these kind of methods of portraiture again, but to represent, people, parts of society, communities who were never really represented on the walls of art galleries, to do this bold statement of saying, okay, we're putting figures of people he knew. Sometimes he would sort of create amalgams of people, so he'd use different elements of different people's features and create these kind of slightly anonymous figures. But he's making these great gestures of presenting, the beautiful, cool Black people that surround him all the time and enabling them to be on the walls.
Should we look at a specific painting by him? Lawdy Mama was created in 1969 and depicts the artist's cousin, Kathy Williams. So kind of in direct contrast to the grandmother portraits being of aristocracy and being commissioned, this is somebody who's in his family. And it's this really striking half-length portrait of a young Black woman who's standing in a very relaxed pose, wearing a short sleeve black dress with a high neck and decorated in a pattern of thin black and red stripes. And perhaps her afro might remind us of halos in paintings in the past, and its rounded shape, so the shape of the whole painting is reflected in the afro and then back into the kind of arch around the top of the painting's shape. And the whole background is gold ground, flat, beautiful, shimmering gold, contrasted against the darkness of her outfit and her skin colour so beautifully.
I think what's interesting about this portrait is that when he was making these works, he was very much thinking about representation and making sure that figures were visible. There were iconic figures within this time that were wearing an afro very symbolically and politically, Kathleen Cleaver, Angela Davis. And many people thought that actually Hendrix's cousin was one of those figures. The fact that actually she's just, I say just, but she is Hendrix's relative in this way, and a sort of distant relative. He is a cousin twice removed even, but elevated in this way because of his use of gold is suddenly really extraordinary. He's not just making a very basic statement about putting a figure onto the wall. What he's doing is he's also saying that this is also part of a long tradition of painting.
Also, the scale of this isn't a small devotional image that, there are icons that are quite small. This is at a scale, as you were saying, the grand manner paintings, or of an altarpiece that was meant more for public display and consumption. He's elevating her to that too, I think, by making this so large, making it feel like it could be almost an altarpiece.
I've got a quote from Hendricks where he talks about his references. He talks about his love of Greek and Roman icons has so much to do with the way that he was thinking about the construction of the work. And he says, beyond the inspiration, it provided a wealth of knowledge and experience about the craft and art of gold leafing. And in fact, the lunette top, this curved top that you talked about, Beks, was a sort of form that he was using in other paintings. He created these two circles and then cut them in half and then attached them to another board. And two of them went on to be used for another work called Father, Son, and ... and the fourth was for this painting called Lawdy Mama. He named the work after a lyric from Nina Simone's, one of Nina Simone's songs. And so there he's kind of trying to sort of reference all different aspects of Black culture and celebrate it for all of its achievements in so many ways. And it's just such an influential work and practice, because he's doing so many things at once. He's talking about contemporary culture and life and celebrating what's beautiful about the world that we live in today, but also harking back to sort of, generations of artists working and depicting the human figure, which is just an extraordinary way of working. And he's been so influential to so many artists ever since.
So we're going to look at the artist Louise Nevelson next, whose work takes us away from painting into structural art, sculpture, and also brings us back to references from much earlier artists working with gold. So, Caroline, would you like to describe to us perhaps one of her particular works that can help us imagine what this artist is doing and introduce us to Louise?
Yes. So Louise Nevelson was a Ukrainian-American artist who is really known for her assemblage sculpture. So first of all, woman sculpture, especially at this time, was quite revolutionary. Assemblage sculpture, too, is sculpture that is made of or is assembled of many component parts. And what those parts are quite crucial to understanding Nevelson's work. And this work that we're looking at, Royal Tide 2, from 1961 to 63. So Louise Nevelson started creating these sort of assemblage sculptures on a smaller scale, and then and she was known for collecting many objects. Her assemblage sculptures were made up of usually wooden fragments. Her dad worked in the lumber industry and at one point was essentially a rag picker for wooden parts. And so she's really, we've been talking about gold as this incredibly rich mythological material, but she's taking trash, literally, from lumber yards, from the streets of New York, and then painting them with gold paint. So she's not gilding it; she's painting it with often spray paint too. Okay. But she previously had worked a lot in black and white, and gold was sort of the last step in her process. And so this work, Royal Tide, is this large assemblage sculpture that's made up of all of these different component wood parts. Her works often take up entire walls. You can almost feel as if you're in a room with all of her treasures that she's then constructed into these different worlds. There's great images of her working on them almost flat first, and it looks like she's looking over like a massive city plan, the way that they're constructed in these boxes and in these squares. She talks a lot about her empire of aesthetics that she's building, and she created a lot of these these spaces with her assemblage sculptures. So Royal Tide is incredibly large and gold and made of different wooden fragments.
Royal Tide is really an extraordinary work because it's made of so many composite parts. Yeah. And this is often what she's doing, where each sort of box, each element of the work is filled with so many different kinds of objects, like fragments of banisters, of different pieces of wood that she's found.
Bits of furniture.
Bits of furniture, exactly.
Taken apart.
But what she's building is really, as Caroline says, into this, almost like this image of a cityscape, but through this language of abstraction, using everyday materials. And so when she paints them into these monochromes, she's flattening them all and making them all sort of uniform in appearance, but suddenly their textures, their forms, the shapes all come out. And so you're confronted by all of these, visually, all of these things, and you get up close, you see the textures within them. So there really are worlds within these boxes. And I think that the gold brings out the lives of what the assemblage parts were more so than her blacks. She talks about how when she paints with black, it nullifies the forms and then they become geometry. Whereas with the gold, the way that it shines, you get more of the textures in them. And she talks about that she wanted to show that the wood picked off the street could be gold. And I think
it's almost alchemical in its
absolutely
transformation of a found object or found objects.
Absolutely. And Arthur Danto, who is a really important art writer and critic from the 20th century, talks about that part of Nevelson's alchemy consists in giving these objects also a second life. and that by sort of concealing the differences and putting them into what he said, a chorus of components and covering them with this paint that brought them into unity with one another is what's so extraordinary about her work. And I think I want to speak a little bit more about her relationship to gold too, because she was an immigrant from Ukraine when it was still the Russian Empire, but she and her family were Jewish and had to immigrate to America because of the pogroms that were going on at the time in the Russian Empire. And so they came to America, and America was referred to the land where the streets were paved with gold. And that image really stuck with her as she grew up. And she talks about gold being the last part in her process. But I think what's also interesting about Louise is that she has so many references that she's going with. Louise was actually really interested in pre-Columbian art, and she was a collector of antiquities. She went to Mexico on various trips and drew a lot of her inspiration from the geometry and history of Mayan and pre-Columbian societies where gold was so prominent. And that unification, I think, of geometry and gold must be in her psyche while working with these pieces. And she's also known for collecting endless furs and also a lot of jewelry. And she also helped design jewelry both for operas and for fashion houses. And if you see photos of her, she's always decked out in lots of different pieces.
Amazing.
And when she talks about gold in jewelry, she says that the minute you have gold, it completely takes over its splendor, the abundance of it, and that abundance is really materialistic. So her relationship to gold, I think, is very layered, and you see that in these works, and also how she interacted with it as a collector, as a woman, where jewelry is part of your armor, part of your myth building, and her outfits and persona was really tied into how she dressed herself, how she collected, how she built these assemblages that she also lived within in her home and studio in New York.
So here we have an artist who's using gold as an opportunity. And I guess in America particularly, but also in the West, gold has also become this thing of consumerism and wealth. And we're going to look at that more after the break as we think about how gold has been referenced by artists as a material that's not just full of symbolism of devotion and opportunity, but has been a very capitalist material as well. So we've talked a lot about the symbolic value of gold, but we can't get away from the fact that, of course, gold has a very real and very high material value as well. And artists, of course, have been really hyper-aware of this. So we're going to look at a few now. So there's an artist, very interested in the materiality of gold, the wealth of gold, the expense of gold, which is Chris Burden, who made Tower of Power in 1985. It's such an interesting work. Could you, Priyesh, describe it to us?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Chris Burden was an artist who was, again, really pushing out the limits of what we might consider artworks and how we come to value artworks in the way we do within this grand, huge, expansive art economy. He was an American artist working in the 1970s, and by the time he was making Tower Power in the 80s, he was thinking about the way institutions might operate, particularly the art market. So Tower Power involved 100 kilograms of gold ingots, which he would stack into this kind of circular pile.
So gold ingots are like those kind of rectangular gold bricks.
Yes.
Like if you imagine
Yes.
the quintessential sort of Bank of England
Yeah.
stack of gold, that's what these look like.
So then these gold bricks would be stacked into this kind of circular pyramid, not very high. And then surrounding this incredibly valuable monument, I guess, mini monument, are these tiny matchstick men parading around, pretending to guard this, all of this gold, as if they're carrying little guns. But of course, they're sort of jokes. They're futile little kind of matchstick men, perhaps a commentary on the way that we might think about a kind of military or kind of the idea of bearing arms within America and what it's kind of really representing and what it might be protecting. But interestingly, when he showed this work, it was shown in a survey exhibition that he had at the New Museum in New York, and the museum had to go to extraordinary lengths to be able to show the work within the museum, not only in trying to find the right value to insure the work and the right insurers to kind of protect the work, but they had to put the work in the most discreet part of the gallery, somewhere where it's not visible at all. They permitted only one person to go and see it at a time, and it had a 24-hour guard standing outside it throughout the run of the exhibition. And just to say physically, 100 kilograms of gold bricks, when you stack it up, isn't very high. No. So when you looked at it through a sort of distant window, you were looking down on it as well. So it suddenly wasn't becoming this monumentalized image of gold bricks stacked up before our eyes, as some might imagine the American dream might be, or when you kind of find a sort of treasure cave. It became actually something quite anticlimactic, I would say, just seeing this gleaming stack of gold bars.
But worth $3 million.
Worth $3 million at the time.
Yeah.
And also the lengths in order to kind of create this sort of preposterous event to happen.
And it was displayed in the corner of near a stairwell. And the fact that everyone couldn't even, they made sure that with the one by one that they also weren't bringing bags or coats so that they couldn't, feasibly steal it
right
into the pocket. As you're saying, the actual experience of encountering this work is very anticlimactic, quite monitored and surveilled.
I think it's interesting as well that you need a certain amount of power as an artist to even create a work like this for your gallery or your agent or anyone to sign up to backing $3 million worth of materials for your sculpture. I think is quite an extraordinary thing.
Especially as part of a larger show where there's other works that need to be insured and thought about.
Is also quite telling about the way institutions might operate and the risks that they're willing to take, whether they can really ensure the value of this amount of material wealth in one go, just to make this kind of interesting statement.
And as the price of gold too has gone up rapidly in the last 5 years, and in the last couple, even more recently, you think about how much more expensive this work continuously gets to be. It is to put on.
Totally. It's not just the value of the art for the sake of the art. There's the material value of the material it has been made from, which the two are so intrinsically now connected. Yeah. We'll look at another work, again, extraordinarily expensive to make, by Maurizio Cattelan, which is titled America, made in 2016, and which is a sculpture of a fully functioning golden toilet cast in 18-karat gold, originally commissioned for the Guggenheim in New York, and crafted from millions of pounds worth of gold, approximately 4.8 million. I mean, absolutely staggering. What does it mean to make a fully functioning toilet out of gold?
Well, Cattelan is such an interesting artist. So he's Italian, known really as the kind of the foremost pop artist of Italy. He makes these hyper-realist sculptures, often taking the form of jokes, including like a fallen pope and a rock in one of his works. We probably all know him because one of his works hit the headlines in the art fairs recently, where he taped a banana to the wall, and it went on sale at auction recently and fetched incredibly high prices. But again, was testing the boundaries of what consists of an artwork. This joke, this artwork, America, really is so telling of what we imagine as the land that's paved with gold. Suddenly you can use the lavatory, the toilet, and relieve yourself on the most valuable material that there is, gold.
So
and it was
fascinating.
a functioning toilet. So if you went to the Guggenheim while it was on display, you could go and join the queue to use the toilet. I think they had a cleaner that used to come in and out after every person, so it would be clean and sanitized, but you could use it.
And glimmering.
And glimmering, sparkling like gold.
And it was also offered on loan to the White House. So quite a typical thing for the White House to request loans. But they requested originally the loan of Vincent van Gogh's Landscape with Snow from 1888 for the president's private quarters. So this is during Donald Trump's first presidency. That loan was declined. And so instead, this work that we've just been talking about, Cattelan's America, was offered in 2017, as a loan to the White House. And
in its place.
Instead of the Van Gogh painting. And it was turned down.
Yeah. Well, I think the White House didn't reply.
Okay, didn't reply.
Yeah.
And it's also been subject to some news recently because the toilet was loaned to Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire here in the UK in 2019. Caroline, do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened or what supposedly may have happened?
Yes, the toilet was taken out in the dead of night and now has been lost since 2019 and likely melted down. And there's something really interesting too about, again, thinking about gold as a material of value. You couldn't sell that toilet on the black market. People would know what it was. It can't go in storage in the same way. But if you melt it down, you can recoup that value of the actual material of the gold itself. So it's not confirmed, but it's likely that it was broken down into smaller parts and then sold for its value as gold, not as an artwork.
So we do know that 3 men have been convicted in connection with the theft. But yes, the toilet has never been recovered. And so this is just the working assumption that this is what has happened to it. And it's sort of a story of history, really, isn't it? That gold objects gets melted down. So much has been lost in this way.
Yeah, but it's so telling in a way where you've got, a toilet, something that is so ubiquitous in every house. Cattelan here is referencing a long history of artists appropriating urinals, toilets within art history. So we might all know Marcel Duchamp's urinal work, where he appropriated a urinal, flipped it on its side, and as a sort of gesture of conceptualism very early in the 20th century, to really test the boundaries of what art is. And so you get artists continuing that tradition, doing it now, using gold, using gold as a way of testing our ideas around value and what that really means. The fact that it was stolen is so interesting. Artworks get stolen all the time. We hear this in the headlines every day. We don't really know what the true motives of these thieves were when they were stealing America from Blenheim Palace, but perhaps it was the fact that they knew it was of some sort of cultural value, but perhaps they valued its weight in gold much more heavily, much more seriously than some sort of cultural art historical gesture.
And Cattelan himself said of the theft, "I always liked heist movies, and finally I'm in one of them." So great for him, I guess, if he's happy. So a final word. Why do we think artists throughout history have been so drawn to gold? Caroline.
It's been so much fun thinking about this for this podcast and thinking about how gold is so enduring and all-encompassing. And there's a great, Walter Benjamin, who is a 20th century German literary critic, writes about alchemy and gold and how that ultimately gold is associated with truth. And there's something in that. I wonder that in the 20th century, these artists are alchemists in a way. They're taking these materials and transforming them into artworks that grapple with really serious history. I think that's what we're seeing with these modern contemporary artists. And with gold, it allows for this, I think, enduring truthfulness, realness, and purity that you can't escape because it's been in every single culture. It's aspirational but physical. It doesn't tarnish, and it's, I think, in a time where we're getting so many different histories and sort of modes of truth to turn to a material that has endured across the centuries, millennia, across the globe. There's something really powerful and poignant in that, that gold gives us a sort of truth of material and a truth and history that gets associated with it when it's used by contemporary artists.
I think on the flip side of that as well, I think the potential for gold to change and transform into so many different kinds of media is also something that I think artists are really drawn to by it. The fact that you can use gold to really transform, going back to this idea of the alchemy of a material. It's there's something about this idea of being able to transform oneself or transform the world around us and shape it, which lends itself so much to the way that I think we exist in societies, to be able to shape and challenge the way that the status quo and the way that we've lived for so many years. So I think gold is a really interesting material to allow all of those spaces of imagination to exist in the world.
Beautiful. So through this mini-series of 3 episodes, we've looked at the beauty and the permanence of gold, its materiality, the incredible techniques used by both goldsmiths and artists across the centuries to create glistening works of art. We've taken a long look back over history, all the way from the tombs of ancient Egypt right through to the modern day, ending with an exploration of the contemporary artists who are still drawing on all the symbolism that we've talked about and materiality of gold in their works. And that brings us to the end of our final episode in our gold mini-series of Stories in Colour. If you would like to take the time to comment and rate and subscribe to the podcast, we would absolutely love that. And if you've got more questions about the story of colour in art and culture, you can email us. We're on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, and we'll put that below in the show notes as well. Or you can send us your questions via our social media channels. Just mention the podcast. So thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Stories in Colour, with massive thanks to our guests, Caroline Miller and Priyesh Mistry.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Beks.
And you can explore lots more on the subject of gold at the National Gallery on our YouTube channel. I've been your host, Beks Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technician was Ian Warren. Our video editor was Jan Kenyon. And with huge thanks to the scientific team here at the National Gallery. And thank you for listening.